In the heart of a sprawling valley surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests, lay the village of Lwanda, a place where customs were not merely traditions but laws written into the very air. Every stone, every pathway, and every doorway carried the weight of generations who had revered order above all else. In Lwanda, obedience was not a choice, it was the cornerstone of life. To disregard it was to invite shame, punishment, or exile. From the moment children could walk, they were taught that to bow before their elders, their leaders, and especially the village chief was to honor not just the person but the ancestors themselves. The act of bowing was sacred. It was a bridge between the living and the wisdom of those who had come before. A bow was not just a gesture, it was acknowledgement of the cosmic order, a symbol that one's pride would not outweigh the collective good. Children who resisted the practice were swiftly corrected, their defiance seen as a threat to the balance that held the village together. Young men and women were reminded daily that respect must be shown through posture and deed. Any failure to bow was considered both impudent and dangerous. Amara was unlike the others. She had grown up within the same rigid walls, attending the same lessons in submission and decorum, yet something in her spirit refused to bend entirely. She understood the customs and revered the wisdom of the elders, but she possessed a courage that refused to let fear dictate her every action. While other girls her age followed the rituals without question, Amara would sometimes pause, her eyes lingering on the horizon, as though she could see beyond the mountains, beyond the rules, and glimpse the world that existed outside unquestioned obedience. Her bravery was not born from arrogance but from an unyielding sense of justice. When she saw villagers punished unfairly, or when she noticed elders taking advantage of their authority, she felt a fire ignite within her chest. It was a quiet fire at first, smoldering beneath her heart, but it grew stronger with every act of injustice she witnessed. This inner strength made her both admired and feared. Some whispered that Amara had inherited the courage of her ancestors in a way no one else had, while others muttered that she was too bold, too proud, and far too aware of her own spirit. Despite her reputation, Amara moved among the villagers with humility. She bowed when necessary, spoke politely to her elders, and carried out her duties with diligence. But there was a spark in her eyes, a quiet defiance, that told those who dared look closer that she would not bow to tyranny or cruelty. She was a young woman who understood the meaning of respect but refused to let respect be twisted into subservience. It was this blend of reverence and independence that made her stand out in a village steeped in conformity. The elders noted her courage in secret, sometimes with worry, sometimes with admiration. Her peers often envied her, though they could not quite articulate why, for Amara did not flaunt her strength. She simply existed, carrying herself with a grace that was both gentle and unshakable, a reminder that the spirit could remain unbroken even when the body bowed. As the village prepared for its upcoming ceremonies and rituals, attention quietly grew beneath the surface. The people of Lwanda had long relied on unquestioned obedience to maintain harmony, and yet the presence of a young woman who carried her own will so openly began to unsettle the usual order. Amara's courage, like a small flame, was enough to stir whispers and doubts among the villagers, setting the stage for a challenge that would test not just her own spirit, but the very foundations of their customs. And so, the village of Pride stood as it always had, ancient, disciplined, and rigid. But now it was quietly shifting, waiting for the moment when courage would confront tradition, and when a young woman named Amara would show that even in a place devoted to submission, the spirit of one fearless heart could. The sun rose over Lwanda, casting golden light across the neatly arranged huts and cobblestone pathways of the village. Birds sang their morning songs, and the air carried the scent of fresh earth and cooking fires. But beneath this ordinary dawn, a tension simmered, a tension that had nothing to do with the day's chores and everything to do with the decree that was about to be announced. The villagers had been called to gather in the central square, a place where the chief's authority was absolute and the weight of tradition pressed heavily on every shoulder. The village chief, a stern man with a long braided beard and eyes as sharp as obsidian, stood atop the raised platform at the heart of the square. His robes, adorned with intricate patterns and ceremonial beads, shimmered in the sunlight, each ornament a symbol of his lineage and power. The villagers watched silently, sensing the importance of the moment as he raised his jeweled staff, a staff that had been passed down from generation to generation, marking him as the unquestioned leader of Lwanda. "My people," he began, his voice carrying across the square with a resonance that demanded attention. "Today I remind you of the duty you owe to our ancestors and to the order that binds this village together. It is not enough to live and labor, you must also show respect, humility, and obedience. Therefore, I decree that all villagers shall bow before me during the grand ceremony that will take place at sunset. Bowing is not mere formality, it is acknowledgement of the sacred law that governs our lives. A murmur spread through the crowd, some nodding in agreement while others exchanged uncertain glances. The chief's gaze swept over them, sharp and unyielding, as though daring anyone to question him. Let it be known, he continued, that refusal to bow will be considered a defiance of both me and the ancestors. Those who refuse shall face severe punishment, for disobedience cannot be tolerated. Obedience is the lifeblood of Lwanda, and those who threaten it threaten us all. The villagers stiffened at his words. Parents glanced nervously at their children, elders whispered warnings, and friends clutched at one another in shared anxiety. The law was clear, and its enforcement had always been ruthless. Yet among them, there stood a young woman whose eyes did not falter, whose posture did not bend under the weight of fear. Amara had heard of the decree before it was publicly announced. Whispers had reached her ears, warning her of the chief's expectation that everyone without exception would bow. Some villagers approached her after the announcement, their voices trembling as they tried to persuade her. Amara, it is dangerous. You must bow, said an older woman, worry etched into her lined face. The chief does not tolerate defiance. Please do not bring harm upon yourself or your family. Amara's response was calm, measured, and unwavering. I respect the customs of our village, she said, her voice carrying with quiet strength, but I cannot bow to someone who rules through fear and cruelty. Respect must be earned, not demanded through terror. I will not compromise my principles, no matter the threat. Some of the villagers recoiled at her words, startled by her boldness. Others felt a spark of admiration and hope, though fear kept them silent. The chief, unaware of the inner stirrings of his people, assumed all were in line, but a seed of doubt had begun to grow. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the square, it became clear that the day would test the limits of tradition and courage alike. Amara's decision was no longer private, it was now a statement in the public eye, a challenge to a decree that had been unquestioned for generations. And in her quiet defiance, she carried the possibility that the old ways could be confronted, that the people of Lwanda might one day see that the power of fear could be broken by the strength of a single, unyielding spirit. After the chief's decree echoed through the village, an unusual tension settled over Lwanda. Normally, the villagers moved through their daily routines with quiet precision, bowing to the chief and performing their tasks without question. But now, conversations shifted in hushed tones, and glances were exchanged with more caution than ever before. The air carried the weight of anticipation, as if the village itself held its breath, sensing that the fabric of its long-standing customs might soon be tested. Amara moved among her peers quietly, her steps deliberate and calm. She did not shout her defiance, nor did she seek to rally the villagers with grand speeches. Instead, she spoke softly to those she trusted, sharing her thoughts with measured words that struck deep beneath the surface. We cannot let fear dictate our every action, she told a group of friends while gathering herbs near the riverbank. Obedience is not respect. True respect comes from understanding, from fairness, from courage. If we bow only because we fear punishment, then what kind of life do we live? Some listened with wide eyes, inspired by the clarity and confidence in her voice. Young men who had previously bowed without question now found themselves questioning the rituals they had followed all their lives. Women who had remained silent in fear felt a stirring of possibility. Amara's courage, though quietly expressed, acted like a spark against dry tinder, and it ignited something subtle but powerful within the hearts of the villagers. Yet not everyone responded with admiration. Some looked upon her with fear and suspicion, unsure of what her defiance might bring. They worried that she was inviting disaster, that the chief's wrath could bring ruin upon the entire village. You should not speak so boldly, whispered one elder to his daughter. The chief sees everything, and he punishes those who stray from the path of obedience. Be careful, for your courage may bring ruin. Despite the fear that rippled through parts of the crowd, others were drawn to Amara's quiet strength. Her words did not demand action, they merely offered clarity. Yet clarity has its own power, and soon whispers began to circulate through the village like a gentle wind moving through reeds. The phrase, "Amara will not bow," was repeated quietly at first, then more openly among friends and neighbors. People began to murmur about the injustice of obeying out of fear, about the possibility of standing for principle even when authority demanded submission. The whispers grew stronger, and with them came a subtle yet undeniable shift. Villagers began to linger in the square longer than usual, exchanging furtive glances as if testing the courage of one another. Mothers whispered the story to their children in coded phrases, teaching them that there was a line between respect and fear. Young men found themselves hesitating when they approached the platform where the chief stood, feeling a quiet pressure to think rather than act blindly. But the chief, sharp-eyed and ever watchful, was not unaware of the change. He noticed the subtle glances, the hurried conversations that ceased when he entered a courtyard, the nervous fidgeting of those who had once bowed without hesitation. Suspicion crept into his mind like a shadow stretching across the village. He could sense that dissent was growing, that obedience was no longer automatic, and that the influence of one young woman could unravel the foundation of his authority if left unchecked. In private he summoned his most trusted guards and advisors. "There are whispers," he said, his voice low but tense, "that not all villagers will obey my command. Watch them closely. Find the source of this defiance and eliminate it before it spreads." His eyes, dark and calculating, lingered on the thought of Amara. Though he did not name her, he knew deep in his bones that she was at the center of this growing unrest. Her courage was a threat not just to his rule, but to the entire structure of fear upon which Lwanda had been built. Meanwhile, Amara remained calm, aware that her quiet words were being noticed. She did not seek to provoke the chief, but she also did not shrink from the truth she carried. Every glance, every conversation, every whispered phrase was a test of courage, both for herself and for the villagers who began to listen. She understood that true change rarely comes from shouting, it comes from planting seeds, letting them grow slowly and trusting that the earth will do its work. By the end of the day the village was no longer the same. Though outwardly the people continued their routines, beneath the surface a current of rebellion flowed. The whispers of dissent had taken root, and the villagers began to see for the first time that obedience could be questioned, that authority could be challenged, and that courage could spread like fire through even the most disciplined of communities. Amara's quiet defiance had done more than inspire, it had awakened the village. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, the chief felt the first prickling of unease, an inkling that the power he had always taken for granted might not hold forever. The day of the grand ceremony arrived with a sky painted in shades of gold and crimson, a striking contrast to the tension that hung over Lwanda. Villagers emerged from their huts and along the winding paths, converging on the main square, the heart of the village. It was a space both sacred and intimidating, where generations had stood in obedience to the chief, bowing as ritual dictated. Today, however, the air was thick with an unusual unease, a palpable electricity that seemed to vibrate through the cobblestones themselves. Families walked in silence, the usual chatter replaced with nervous murmurs. Parents held their children close, whispering reminders of what was expected, their eyes darting to the raised platform where the chief would soon appear. The square, usually bustling with casual trade and laughter, was now a stage for something far heavier, a test of loyalty, courage, and the unspoken limits of authority. The villagers assembled in orderly rows, their eyes fixed on the central platform. Their hearts beat in anxious rhythm, some quickened by fear, others by curiosity. The tension was so dense it seemed almost tangible, a weight pressing down upon every shoulder, every bowed head. Even the elders, who had lived through countless ceremonies, exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something unprecedented might occur. Amara moved quietly through the crowd, her footsteps deliberate, unhesitant. She felt the eyes of the villagers upon her, some filled with hope, some with fear, some with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Though her heart held no fear of bowing, she knew the act she intended to take would ripple far beyond herself. Standing upright, her chin lifted, she exuded calm resolve. It was the kind of presence that could inspire courage in others or draw the wrath of those in power. The chief finally emerged from his private chambers, his robes glimmering in the morning light. He ascended the platform with slow, deliberate steps, his staff held high, the jewels on his fingers catching the sun and scattering glints of light across the assembled villagers. His expression was stern, carved with lines of authority and expectation. Every eye in the square followed his movements, every breath held as if the slightest exhale might betray the tension that bound them. He raised his hand, and the crowd instinctively straightened, their posture betraying the ingrained habit of submission. "Today," the chief declared, his voice deep and commanding, "we gather to honor the order that has sustained Lwanda for generations. Each of you shall bow before me, acknowledging the sacred law that binds us and paying respect to the authority that protects our village." His gaze swept across the villagers, sharp and unwavering. "Let it be known that defiance will not be tolerated. Those who refuse shall face the consequences without mercy. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd. Some shuffled uneasily, whispering reassurances to their neighbors. Others stared at the chief with wide eyes, caught between ingrained obedience and the stirrings of doubt awakened by Amara's quiet defiance in recent days. It was as if the square itself were holding its breath, waiting for a signal that would either reaffirm the established order or shatter it completely. Amara stood among them, her posture unwavering, her gaze steady. She felt the weight of countless expectations pressing down upon her, but she did not yield. The whispers of courage that had circulated through the village in the days leading up to this moment coalesced in her mind like a shield, giving her strength. She was not merely standing for herself, she carried the quiet hopes of those who feared to speak, those who longed to question, those who had begun to see that submission was not the only path. The villagers around her glanced nervously at one another, some reluctant to meet her gaze, some emboldened by it. The air was taut, a wire stretched to its limit, vibrating with anticipation. Even the guards who flanked the platform seemed uncertain, their eyes flicking between the chief and Amara, sensing the tension that defied explanation. As the chief raised his hand again, signaling the start of the ceremonial bowing, all eyes fell on Amara. In that moment, the square was no longer merely a gathering of villagers, it had become a crucible. Fear, anticipation, and courage mingled in the air like sparks ready to ignite. The future of Lwanda, the unspoken boundaries of authority, and the very nature of respect hung in the balance, waiting for the choice of one unyielding young woman to define what would come next. As the chief's hand hovered in the air, signaling the villagers to bow, a profound silence fell over the square. The usual rhythm of compliance, the murmurs of obedience, and the shuffle of feet ceased entirely. All eyes turned to Amara, who stood at the front, her back straight, shoulders relaxed yet resolute. Unlike the others, she did not lower her gaze or bend at the waist. She remained upright, exuding a calm strength that seemed almost otherworldly in the tense air of the square. A collective gasp spread through the crowd, rippling from one end of the square to the other. Some villagers froze, their fear mingling with disbelief. Never in living memory had anyone dared defy the chief so openly during a ceremonial event. Children clutched at their parents' hands, unsure whether to admire the courage before them or cower in fear at what might come. Elders exchanged worried glances, whispering among themselves about the audacity of a young woman standing so boldly against authority. The chief's face darkened instantly. Anger flared behind his eyes, a scorching heat that seemed to radiate across the platform. His lips pressed into a thin line as he took a step forward, the jeweled staff trembling slightly in his hand. "How dare you," he thundered, his voice cracking like lightning over the square, "defy the command of your chief? You know the law, yet you stand insolent before all of Lwanda." Amara's voice rang out clearly, unshaken, even as whispers of unease swirled through the villagers. "I do not defy the ancestors or disrespect our traditions," she said, her tone firm yet measured, "but I will not bow to fear. Authority earned through intimidation is not worthy of reverence. I stand for truth, for justice, and for the dignity of every villager. I will not bend before cruelty." A murmur of awe swept through the crowd. Some villagers whispered among themselves, astonished at the clarity and conviction in her words. Others, who had previously feared speaking out, felt a quiet fire ignite in their hearts. It was as if a barrier they had long accepted had been broken, and for the first time, they glimpsed the possibility that obedience could be a choice, not a requirement enforced by terror. The chief's fury grew with every heartbeat. He slammed his staff against the platform, sending a sharp clatter echoing across the square. "Do you wish to bring ruin upon yourself and your family?" he shouted, his voice vibrating with rage. "Will you test the limits of my patience? Obedience is not optional. You will bow or you will face the consequences." Even as the chief's threats intensified, Amara did not waver. Her gaze swept across the villagers, meeting the eyes of young men and women who had long been too afraid to question the rules. She saw hope flickering in some, hesitation in others, and admiration in those who understood the bravery it took to stand alone. Each look reinforced her resolve. She realized that her courage was no longer solitary, it was becoming a symbol, a beacon of the possibility for change. The ripple effect of her defiance was immediate. A few villagers, emboldened by her stance, straightened their backs and lifted their heads, as if testing whether they too could resist. Small sparks of courage, long buried under generations of fear, began to stir. Even the guards who flanked the chief hesitated, uncertain of how to enforce submission when one person's courage challenged the expectations of everyone around them. In that moment, the square became a crucible of power and principle. Amara's defiance was not merely an act of personal bravery, it was a challenge to the entire structure of fear that had governed Lwanda for so long. Every eye upon her, every murmur of approval or shock, contributed to a growing sense that the old ways might be questioned, that obedience need not be blind, and that courage could ripple outward, touching hearts and inspiring actions that had once seemed impossible. As the wind stirred through the square, carrying the scent of earth and dust, it was as though the very village itself held its breath. Amara remained steadfast, her chin lifted, eyes bright with unyielding resolve, and in her silence as much as in her words, she demonstrated a truth that would resonate far beyond this single moment. Bravery is contagious, and the spirit of one courageous soul can awaken the courage of many. The chief's anger had reached a fevered pitch, his face flushed and his voice thunderous, carrying across the square like a storm over the hills. "Make her submit," he commanded, slamming his staff against the platform. "Show her the consequences of defiance." Immediately the enforcers, burly men in polished armor, faces hardened by years of enforcing obedience, stepped forward, moving with deliberate precision toward Amara. Their eyes were cold, their muscles taut, and each carried the weight of authority like a weapon. The villagers held their breath, a tension so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Mothers clutched their children, elders shook their heads in worry, and neighbors exchanged silent glances, torn between admiration for Amara's courage and fear for the peril she faced. The air seemed to vibrate with both dread and a quiet, burgeoning hope, as if the village itself sensed that the events unfolding in that moment would leave a permanent mark on its history. The guards stopped just a few steps from Amara, forming a semicircle around her, their presence meant to intimidate. One of them, the tallest, reached out with a gloved hand as if to grasp her shoulder and force her to bend, while another brandished a staff, tapping it menacingly on the stone ground. The chief's voice boomed from the platform above. "You will obey. Bow now or feel the wrath of Lwanda." Amara stood firm, her gaze unwavering. Her breathing was steady, each exhale a testament to the inner resolve that had carried her this far. She did not flinch at the approaching hands, the threatening weapons, or the collective expectation of the village. Instead, she met the guard's eyes calmly, as though to say that no act of force could bend the spirit of a heart anchored in principle. The tension in the square grew unbearable. Some villagers shifted on their feet, uncertain whether to intervene, to cry out, or to hide. Their fear collided with admiration and hope, creating a strange, electrifying energy that seemed to hum through the air. For many, Amara's courage was inspiring, but the threat of violence kept their lips sealed. They felt caught between centuries of ingrained obedience and the possibility that someone, one single person, could break the cycle of fear. The chief, furious at her continued defiance, leaned forward, his hands gripping the railing of his platform. "Do not test my patience," he shouted. "Do you think your pride can protect you from what is coming?" He gestured sharply, and one of the enforcers stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over Amara. The crowd gasped collectively, sensing the imminent clash of wills. But Amara's composure did not falter. She lifted her chin higher, her eyes steady, and spoke in a voice that rang clear above the murmurs and the chief's threats. "I will not bow to cruelty. Fear is not authority. True respect cannot be forced. You may try to break me, but the spirit within cannot be chained or bowed." A shiver ran through the crowd. Some villagers looked away, too afraid to meet her gaze, yet others felt a flicker of courage ignite within themselves. The air seemed to shift, as though her defiance had given permission for the unspoken desire in their hearts. The desire to challenge injustice, to question the absolute power that had always dominated their lives. The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second, a moment long enough to make the chief's anger flare even higher. They were trained to act without question, yet the calm certainty in Amara's eyes unsettled them. For the first time, the weight of fear wavered, replaced by a creeping uncertainty. Could the power they had enforced for so long truly be challenged? Could one person's courage alter the balance they had always assumed immutable? In that moment, the village held its breath, suspended between the threat of violence and the promise of change. Amara stood as a living testament to the power of unyielding spirit, a beacon amid fear, showing all who watched that courage could meet tyranny with unwavering strength, and that sometimes hope and fear could exist in the same heartbeat, colliding in a space where destiny itself seemed to wait. The chief's face twisted with fury as Amara's defiance remained unbroken, her eyes steady and unwavering despite the threat of punishment. His voice rose, a bellow that echoed through the square, calling for submission and obedience, yet each command seemed only to fuel the tension in the air. The villagers watched, hearts pounding, unsure whether to intervene, flee, or continue to stand in fearful awe of the unfolding confrontation. Suddenly, a subtle vibration coursed through the ground beneath their feet. At first it was almost imperceptible, a quiver in the stone paving of the central square. The chief noticed it first, his scowl faltering as he felt the uneven tremor beneath his sandals. "What trickery is this?" he barked, lurching slightly as the floor shifted beneath him. The enforcers tensed, gripping their weapons as the vibration grew stronger. The tremor intensified, spreading outward from the center of the square. Dust and small pebbles rolled across the cobblestones as if the ground itself had taken a deep, deliberate breath. The villagers froze, eyes widening in disbelief and fear. Mothers clutched their children, elders muttered prayers, and young men and women gripped one another's hands. The once solid square now seemed alive, responsive, and unpredictably powerful. Amara remained calm, her presence serene amid the chaos. She lowered her gaze slightly, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude and trust to the spirits of the land. "Stand firm," she murmured, not to herself alone, but as a quiet call to the villagers around her. "The earth listens. It sees the injustice. It knows the cruelty that oppresses us." Her words, though soft, carried a weight that resonated with those who could hear beyond fear. As if in response, the tremors grew more pronounced. The cobblestones shifted slightly under the chief's feet, forming small cracks and sending a ripple through the assembled crowd. Panic flashed across the faces of the enforcers as the floor seemed to swell and pulse with energy, almost as if it had a heartbeat of its own. The chief staggered, his anger turning into confusion and then fear. "Step aside," he demanded, but his voice now trembled, barely carrying the same authority as before. The ground's reaction intensified. Thick lines of soil and dust snaked through the square, creeping toward the chief and his enforcers. Every movement of the earth felt deliberate, like an extension of the very principle Amara embodied, that injustice, cruelty, and oppression could not stand unchallenged. The villagers gasped collectively, some taking cautious steps backward, others frozen in awe. Small stones and dust swirled around Amara, drawn subtly toward her as if the land recognized her courage. The air was filled with a low rumble, a voice from the earth itself, carrying a message of justice and retribution. The chief's lavish robes were caught momentarily in the rising dust, the power he had relied upon suddenly reduced to insignificance against the force awakening beneath him. With each tremor, the chief's attempts at intimidation faltered. He stomped, shouted, and gestured violently, yet the floor remained unyielding in its response. For the first time, the villagers saw that authority rooted in fear was fragile, that submission enforced by cruelty could be undone not just by human courage, but by the natural world recognizing the injustice it had long witnessed. Amara stepped forward calmly, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, and the tremors responded to her intent. Her gaze swept over the crowd, offering a sense of reassurance and solidarity. The villagers' fear began to mingle with a growing sense of hope. If the earth itself could rise to defend her, perhaps their courage could follow. The tremors were no longer frightening, they were a signal that justice, once awakened, could not be easily suppressed. As the chief's anger peaked, the floor's movement became undeniable. Cracks widened, and small sections of the ground shifted suddenly beneath the oppressors, forcing them to stumble and grasp at each other for balance. The soil, once a silent witness to injustice, had become a living force, swallowing the arrogance and cruelty that had threatened to dominate the village for generations. Amara's defiance, coupled with the awakening of the floor beneath her, created a scene the villagers would never forget. The tremors were not merely a physical response, they were a manifestation of justice itself, a reminder that cruelty and oppression, no matter how deeply rooted, could be overturned by courage, righteousness, and the will of the earth. The tremors that had begun subtly now escalated into a force that none could ignore. The ground beneath the chief's platform shuddered violently, sending a shockwave through the assembled villagers. Dust and pebbles rattled across the square, and a low rumbling sound emanated from the earth, deep and resonant, as if the land itself were groaning under the weight of centuries of injustice. The chief stumbled, his jeweled staff slipping from his grasp, and the enforcers behind him faltered, momentarily unsure of their footing. Panic erupted like wildfire. The villagers who had gathered to witness the ceremony froze at first, eyes wide with disbelief. Then came the screams, sharp, urgent, chaotic. Mothers clutched their children and dragged them backward, young men leapt aside to avoid the shifting stones, and elders shouted prayers to ancestors and spirits alike. Fear rippled through the crowd, tangling with awe, as the earth responded not to anger but to justice. Beneath the chief, the cracks widened rapidly, splitting the ground into jagged lines that glimmered faintly with a mysterious light, as if the soil itself had been charged with the energy of righteousness. The platform that had once elevated the tyrant now trembled precariously. His voice, once commanding and full of authority, cracked into terrified shouts. "Hold fast," he cried to his enforcers, but the words had lost all power, and the ground beneath them betrayed their strength. With a thunderous groan, a portion of the platform collapsed. The chief and his closest enforcers lost their footing and were swallowed by the widening fissures. Screams of terror echoed as they fell, the soil closing over them in an almost deliberate, unyielding grip. The earth did not spare them. It rose as a barrier against oppression, a force that would not allow cruelty to stand unchallenged. The sound of crumbling stones, combined with the terrified cries of those who witnessed it, filled the air with a surreal mixture of horror and vindication. Amara stood at the edge of the square, her posture calm and unwavering. She did not flinch as the ground swallowed the tyrants. Instead, she breathed deeply, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath her feet. The tremors, though violent around her, seemed to recognize her presence, guiding their power in a protective arc that spared her entirely. Her courage had aligned with the natural justice of the land, and in that alignment she was untouchable. The villagers, once frozen by fear, now surged with emotion. Some cried out in shock, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. Others cheered quietly, hearts pounding with a mixture of relief and awe. The tyrants who had ruled them with cruelty were gone, and the ground that had been trampled under injustice had risen to protect one who had stood for truth. Amara's presence at the center of this upheaval became a beacon, a symbol of the triumph of courage over oppression. Among the crowd, whispers spread quickly, carrying both disbelief and reverence. "She did not falter," murmured one elder, voice trembling. The land itself rose to defend her. A young mother clutched her child and whispered, "Courage is stronger than fear." Even those who had once doubted her bravery felt a spark of hope ignite in their hearts, realizing that tyranny could be overturned, and justice could be absolute when met with unwavering resolve. The fissures beneath the chief's former platform slowly settled, though the scars remained visible as jagged lines etched across the square. The earth seemed to sigh, as if releasing the weight of oppression it had borne for too long. The villagers approached cautiously, eyes wide and reverent, to witness the place where their oppressors had vanished. The memory of the trembling ground, the rumbling fissures, and the collapse of tyranny would remain etched in their minds for generations. Amara looked over the crowd, her gaze steady and calm, as the first stirrings of relief and celebration swept through them. She had faced not only the threat of physical harm but the weight of generations of fear and obedience. And yet she had stood unbroken, guided by principle and courage. In her triumph, the villagers saw a new path, a way to live without fear, to honor justice, and to recognize the power of an unwavering spirit. The collapse of the chief and his enforcers was not merely a punishment, it was a lesson carved into the earth itself. The tyranny that had once overshadowed the village was no more, and in its place arose a symbol of hope, bravery, and the enduring power of one courageous soul to change the fate of many. The square, once tense with fear, now hummed with a different kind of energy, one of awe, wonder, and slowly growing courage. Villagers who had moments before cowered behind one another now dared to lift their heads, their eyes tracing the jagged cracks in the earth where the chief and his enforcers had vanished. The memory of the ground swallowing those who ruled through cruelty lingered in the air, a vivid reminder that power founded on fear was fragile, and that courage could shift the balance of even the most entrenched authority. Amara stood in the center of the square, calm and composed, her presence radiating a quiet strength. Her posture was upright, her eyes clear and steady, and her voice, when she spoke, carried easily across the assembly without a trace of arrogance. "Do you see now?" she said softly, yet each word carried weight. "No person should rule through fear. Blind obedience does not honor tradition, it enslaves the spirit. Courage and justice are the true measures of strength." The villagers exchanged glances, their faces slowly brightening with comprehension. Mothers held their children closer, whispering lessons of bravery in their ears. Young men and women, once hesitant to question authority, began to straighten their backs, feeling a newfound resolve take root. Elders, who had long watched the cycles of tyranny repeat themselves, nodded slowly, recognizing the significance of what had just occurred. It was a lesson written not in words or edicts, but in the very earth itself. The atmosphere shifted palpably. Fear, which had dominated the village for generations, began to dissolve, replaced by a cautious optimism. Whispers rose among the crowd, tentative at first, then louder, carrying sentiments that had long been suppressed. "If she can stand, we can too," one villager murmured. Another added, "The land has shown us that injustice cannot last." The seeds of collective courage had been sown, nurtured by the example of one person's unwavering defiance. Amara moved through the villagers, her steps deliberate yet unthreatening. She offered quiet reassurances to those still trembling from the shock, her presence a living symbol of resilience. "Courage is not the absence of fear," she said, addressing the growing murmurs, "but the choice to act rightly despite it. Fear only has power if we allow it to dictate our actions. Remember this day and carry its lesson forward." Even the younger children, who had clung to their parents in alarm moments earlier, now looked on with wide eyes, absorbing the extraordinary event. The story of what had happened, the ground rising against the tyrants, the chief and his enforcers swallowed by the very platform that had symbolized oppression, would be retold countless times, a story that would teach them that injustice could be met with courage, and that the spirit of one brave individual could awaken the conscience of an entire community. The villagers began to gather together, not in fear, but in quiet celebration and reflection. They discussed what they had witnessed, each adding their own interpretation, each feeling a renewed sense of agency. For the first time, they understood that obedience was not sacred in itself. It was the integrity and justice behind actions that truly mattered. The awakening of the people was more than just the recognition of Amara's bravery, it was a realization that the structures of fear could be dismantled, and that unity and courage could replace tyranny and silence. By the time the sun had dipped low on the horizon, painting the village in warm hues of gold and amber, the square was no longer a place of intimidation and oppression. It had become a space of reflection, learning, and inspiration. The villagers, forever changed by the events of the day, carried with them a newfound understanding. Fear can be faced, oppression can be challenged, and when one stands for what is right, even the land itself may rise in support. The village that had once trembled under the weight of fear and blind obedience now awoke to a new dawn, one filled with the soft hum of possibility and hope. Where walls had once been erected to symbolize power and control, spaces were now rebuilt to reflect community, fairness, and mutual respect. The air seemed lighter, carrying the scent of renewal and the subtle murmur of conversations that spoke not of dread, but of cooperation and shared vision. Villagers moved about with a sense of purpose and dignity, carrying stones and timber, planting gardens, and restoring the public spaces that had long been neglected under the tyranny of fear. Every action, no matter how small, reflected a commitment to a new way of living, a way where authority was earned through integrity and compassion rather than imposed through intimidation. Children laughed freely, running through the squares, their voices echoing against structures that now seemed welcoming rather than oppressive. At the heart of this transformation was Amara, whose courage had sparked a profound shift in the collective consciousness of the village. She walked among the people, offering guidance, encouragement, and wisdom, but never command. Her presence alone was a reminder that leadership rooted in principle and humility inspired far more loyalty than domination ever could. Villagers looked to her not as a ruler, but as a beacon of what was possible when courage met justice. The lessons of that fateful day, when the floor had risen against the tyrannical chief and swallowed him and his enforcers, were embedded in the consciousness of every villager. They recounted the story to one another, emphasizing Amara's bravery and the miraculous intervention of the earth itself. The tale became more than a memory, it became a living guide for behavior, shaping how disputes were resolved, how elders treated the young, and how decisions were made in communal life. Fear was no longer the glue holding society together. Understanding, empathy, and fairness had taken its place. New councils were formed, bringing together representatives of all ages and backgrounds. Decisions were debated openly with input from elders, youth, and women alike. The spirit of participation and accountability infused every aspect of village life. Where once the villagers had bowed automatically, now they engaged in dialogue, ensuring that each voice mattered. The structures of governance, once rigid and hierarchical, were transformed into networks of cooperation, guided by shared responsibility and moral integrity. Amara also took the time to teach the younger generations the lessons she had learned through her trials. She emphasized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act rightly despite it. She spoke of justice as an active practice, requiring vigilance and compassion, and reminded them that integrity must guide every action. The children, inspired by her example, carried these lessons forward, shaping their own understanding of leadership and ethics. In time, the village itself became a symbol to neighboring communities. Travelers would visit and hear the story of Amara and the day when fear was conquered, and a single act of steadfast courage reshaped an entire society. Her name was spoken with reverence, and her actions were immortalized in songs, murals, and oral histories. Each retelling reinforced the values of fairness, courage, and respect, ensuring that generations would remember that power must serve the people, not subjugate them. As the sun set over the revitalized village, casting golden light over newly built homes and gardens, the air was filled with a sense of peace and purpose. The transformation was not just in the physical structures or the systems of governance, but in the hearts and minds of every villager. They had learned that tyranny can be confronted, that fear can be overcome, and that a community built on integrity and respect would endure far longer than one built on domination. Amara's courage, once a single spark, had ignited a lasting flame within the village, a flame that would continue to illuminate the path of justice and fairness for all who called it home. Long after the events that had shaken the village to its core, the central square retained the marks of that fateful day. The cracks in the earth, jagged and uneven, were no longer seen as scars of destruction, but as sacred reminders of the power of justice and courage. Villagers would pause when walking across the square, feeling the slight tremor beneath their feet, and remember the moment when Amara had stood firm, defying tyranny and awakening the very land to act in her defense. Children grew up listening to stories of the fearless young woman who refused to bow, who faced down the oppressive chief, and who had inspired the earth itself to rise. They traced the cracks with their fingers, imagining the ground alive and protective, a silent ally of the brave. Parents recounted these tales during evenings by the fire, embedding the lessons of courage, justice, and integrity into the minds and hearts of the next generation. Each retelling added depth to the legend, emphasizing that even the most immovable structures could bend to the force of righteous resolve. The elders organized gatherings in the square, where villagers shared their experiences and reflections. They spoke not only of the event itself but of what it represented, a triumph of spirit over fear, principle over blind obedience, and the enduring power of standing up for what is right. The floor became a living classroom, teaching that courage was not merely an individual act, but a force capable of awakening communities, inspiring collective strength, and demanding accountability from those who wield power unjustly. Pilgrims from nearby villages began to visit, drawn by the story of Amara and the miraculous response of the earth. They marveled at the cracked but resilient ground, reverently touching it and offering prayers of gratitude. The villagers, once bound by fear, shared the tale generously, teaching that the land itself honors justice and will rise for those who act with integrity. The square became a place of reflection, where disputes were settled not through intimidation but through dialogue, fairness, and a recognition of mutual responsibility. Amara herself continued to walk among the villagers, not as a ruler but as a teacher and guide. She reminded everyone that the earth's response was not magic alone. It was a reflection of human courage aligned with righteousness. The ground does not act without reason, she would say. It listens to the hearts of those who are true. Stand for what is right, and even the earth will support you. Her words became as sacred as the stories of her deeds, and together, they wove a moral fabric that strengthened the village's culture for generations. Over time, festivals were held to commemorate the day of the uprising. Villagers would gather in the square, recounting the tale with songs, dances, and dramatizations of Amara's courage. Children performed plays, mimicking the trembling floor and the chief's fall, while elders narrated the lessons embedded in the event. The floor, once a mere stage for tyranny, had been transformed into a symbol of empowerment, resilience, and moral accountability. The legacy of the ground extended beyond the village itself. Neighboring communities, inspired by the story, began to re-evaluate their own practices of obedience and authority. The tale spread, not as a warning of destruction, but as a guide to ethical living and courageous action. It reminded all who heard it that injustice cannot stand when confronted with integrity, and that even the most seemingly immovable forces, like the earth itself, can bend to the will of truth. Generations came to understand that the floor was more than soil and stone. It was a teacher, a witness, and a guardian of justice. And in every footstep taken upon it, the villagers felt a connection to Amara's courage, a reminder that standing for what is right can move hearts, minds, and even the earth itself.